Emilio Gentile was born in Boggiano, Italy in 1946. Like many academics in Italy, he not only studied at the University of Rome La Sapienza, but never actually left the place. In contrast to the United States, where a sort of incest taboo says you don't pursue your career where you got your PhD, Italy and many other European countries had a tradition of scholars training their own replacements in-house, a tradition that is only beginning to break down today under the influence of the European Union. Gentile spent his entire scholarly life, from student to professor emeritus of contemporary history, in Uniroma's Department of Political Sciences. He is one of Italy's leading cultural historians, well known for drawing a parallel between organized religion and political parties, particularly the totalitarian parties like the Italian fascists from the middle of the 20th century. This article summarizes his numerous illustrations of ways in which Mussolini and the Italian fascists deliberately shaped their political movement in imitation of the Catholic Church, but with a secular rather than supernatural focus. For how many different creations by the fascists can you find analogies in organized religion? Ask yourself, how are these pseudo-religious features different from what we have been describing for traditional religions so far? What becomes sacred in a political religion? Are there any applications of this story to the world almost 100 years after the original fascist experiment with political religion? Bella suggested hopefully that civil religion doesn't necessarily have to mean actually worshiping the state, but all too often this can happen. The fascist movement in Italy in the second quarter of the 20th century provides one example of how far this can go. Gentile gives us some brief historical signposts to guide our understanding, and it's a good idea to start with them so we can see how it all came to pass. You can't worship a nation-state until there is such a thing as a nation-state, and until recently that was the problem in the boot of Italy, which was divided into petty kingdoms ruled by a bunch of royal families. At the interface of politics and religion, the divine right of kings gave a religious stamp of approval to the right of these families literally to own and inherit whole societies. With the examples of revolutions, first by the Americans and then by the French, Italians like Giuseppe Mazzini became radicals devoted to throwing out the royal families, monopolizing all these little territories. In their place, Mazzini and his Young Italian movement wanted a democratic republic like the American and French examples, ruled, as he said, by neither pope nor king, only by God and the people. It's interesting that he called on both God and the people, not just the people, just the way George Washington did. Eventually, Italy did unify into a single new nation-state in 1861, the same year that the Civil War broke out in the United States. But sadly for Mazzini and those like him, the new country still had a king, not a democracy. Mazzini was disappointed. One thing he blamed for the failure to create an Italian republic instead of a kingdom was the absence of a unifying identity among the common people, a sense that they all belonged to something. Basically, the absence of what Bella called a civil religion. If we fast forward half a century after the unification of the Kingdom of Italy into the early 20th century, Italy still officially had a king, but the entire spectrum of political parties were fighting each other from the left to the right. The government never quite made up its mind about Italy's place in World War I, switching alliances in the middle of the war and conducting a haphazard campaign against Austria-Hungary that led to major defeats, even though Italy ended up on the winning side in the war. The different political groups in the country were deeply divided both during and after the war. Horrible losses of 600,000 dead and about 1 million wounded were matched by over 1 million soldiers brought up on charges of desertion, disobedience, or refusal to appear after being drafted. The country still had not been able to inspire unity among either its leaders or its population. Italy managed the peace no better than the war. Inflation and unemployment rose to crisis levels by the end of the 19-teens and the early 1920s. A whole generation of people were desperate for some kind of cause any cause that they could actually believe in, but there was still no real civil religion. During the political chaos and economic collapse, Mussolini and other leaders encouraged right-wing groups that included many unemployed former soldiers from the World War. Economic problems had given rise to massive growth of both Catholic and socialist labor unions among factory workers, and to uprisings by landless farm workers who started seizing land for themselves from large landowners. It started to look like the Russian Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was going to spread to Italy only a couple of years later. Only the bitter hostility between Catholic and socialist unions may have prevented it. But the right-wing gangs dressed in their black shirts began to burn down newspaper offices that published socialist newspapers, invade city council meetings and beat up elected socialist representatives or burn down their houses, and get into street fights with union members, which they usually won, frequently killing some union workers. The police and the army did not stop these private gangs, partly because they couldn't, and partly because industrialists and landowners, and even some middle-class white-collar people, were happy to see the unions destroyed. In October of 1922, some 25,000 fascist black shirts joined in the March on Rome, taking over train stations and government offices. The government was afraid to break up these private gangs because they thought the army and police might not obey orders. So the king asked Mussolini to form his own government, even though there had been no election. The fascists came to power by sheer intimidation and violence, and instead of democracy and representative government, quickly had to resort to forced suppression of their political opponents. But one of the reasons that Mussolini survived and even became popular was that his fascists were able to present themselves as saving the country from the Bolsheviks, who not only threatened the landlords and factory owners, but also wanted to get rid of organized religion and even do away with separate countries as well as kings when the workers of the world all united. The fascists used this threat of the Bolsheviks, which seemed very real in 1919 and 1920, to justify totalitarian takeover of the government. Totalitarian politics do not allow for any competition with political rulers. Other parties are all traitors, just like the labor unions. The private gangs of black shirts became a recognized national militia, arresting or simply beating up or killing any critics or political opponents of the fascist leaders. These national leaders replaced local elected officials with hand-picked appointments of their loyal supporters. And of course, the people who prospered the most economically from totalitarian control were the people in charge of this political pyramid scheme. Such absolute control of not only politics, but also the economy, the schools, and every other social institution from the top down, starting with the dictatorial powers of a supreme leader and backed up by the use of force, unrestrained by any rule of law, controlled the lives of every person in the country even more tightly than any king had ever done. Orwell's portrait of the totalitarian system in his famous book, 1984, vividly shows the trap into which the people of Italy had fallen. But rule by sheer force and intimidation actually is a very inefficient way to get people to do what you want. They will obey only as long as you stand over them with your whip or your gun. Turn your back, and unless they actually believe in what they're doing, you could be in serious trouble. This is why Mussolini and his fascists very carefully made peace with the powerful Catholic Church in Italy. A few years after they took over by force, they made a deal with the Pope. By the terms of the Lateran Accord, the Catholic Church got their own little independent country, Vatican City, which still is not legally a part of Italy, but its own country. And the Catholic Church was recognized as the official state church of Italy as well. In return, the Pope agreed to support the nationalist and fascist efforts to control Italy, something he had never agreed to do for the other political parties in the past. He agreed to provide God to Italy, and Mussolini agreed to give Italy to God, at least on paper. As we will see next, the fascists did much more than just cut a deal with the Pope. Their efforts to create a political religion reached out in many other directions. But no matter in what direction you look at these efforts, they always involve the total control of anything to do with religion, just as in the case of education or the economy or any other institution in society, by the political institution, which in turn is controlled from the top down by dictatorial leaders with no actual accountability to anyone else. No matter where we look in the political religion created by the fascists, the aim is always precisely to make not only the country, but those leaders themselves into religious objects, and to be not only obeyed, but worshipped, their power based on sacred principles defined by that political religion. Mussolini and the fascists succeeded where other political parties had failed. They brought the Catholic Church into a deal to help them motivate the population and control Italy. But they were never comfortable just to use the Catholic Church for such religious motivation. After all, the Pope and the Catholic population remained a separate organization and community in its own right, and the totalitarian political goal is to centralize not only all power, but all authority under absolute, unquestioned control of the political leadership. So the fascists set out right from the start in the early 1920s to construct their own new political religion. The people in charge of this project often repeated that the fascist party itself should become a kind of religious military order. They worked constantly to put their politics into religious language and to turn the party and the state into religious objects to be worshipped as ultimate values by the people. For inspiration, they did not build on a foundation of Christianity, let alone the Catholic Church that was their rival in this sense. Instead, they looked back to the classical Roman Empire when it ruled most of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. They wanted to put those images into people's minds whenever they thought of the modern fascists. Significantly, this transcendent goal at the heart of their manufactured political religion, not a goal to guide the personal life of an individual. This is the shell game at the heart of every totalitarian effort. The ultimate goals are always expressed in terms of the country as a collective, almost religious symbol. The fasci, that bundle of sticks with an axe head on it that gave their party its name, was a Roman imperial symbol. Each stick by itself is easily broken, but if you bind them together in a bundle, they become virtually unbreakable. Message: you're one of those sticks. But if you look behind the curtain of this collective nationalist symbol, you find the people who control the ruling party pulling all the levers and reaping all the rewards. Individual men and women are only cogs in this totalitarian machine. In 1930, Mussolini codified this selfless anonymity of ordinary people with an official slogan for every fascist: believe, obey, fight. You don't think for yourself. You don't debate policies or object to things you don't like or agree with. You're supposed to cultivate a blind faith in a kind of divine inspiration and wisdom that flows from the absolute political authority of your rulers. They are always right because they're looking towards the highest ultimate goal, the glory of the country. A quote from the Manual for Good Fascists sums this up. Quote, "The fascist militiaman must serve Italy purely, with a spirit imbued by a profound mysticism, backed up by an unshakable faith, that he should accept his sacrifice as being the aim of his faith." Unquote. Not only must you have a truly religious faith in your leader, and therefore do everything he tells you to do, instantly and without question or hesitation, but this even extends to sacrificing your own life for the good of the country, which in this case means for the good of the leader himself. Anything less than complete faith in the leader is weakness, imperfection, and failure. Anything less than instant obedience is treason. If you aren't willing to die whenever the boss commands it, you're a coward letting your country down. These are the kinds of values and ideas that the fascists deliberately built into their political religion. Gentile quotes Gustave Le Bon, a conservative French scholar, who advised that, quote, "a religious or political belief is based on faith, but it could never last without rituals and symbols," unquote. Mussolini himself also often quoted Le Bon and took this advice to heart. The fascist political religion immediately began inventing public rituals to get people involved in practicing what the party preached. The party organized uniforms and marching and camps and other activities for children. The initiation of new members into the fascist party was not just putting your name on a voter registration card and marking a box for fascist. It was a formal ceremony that took place in a party building, with your family and other party members present, deliberately modeled on religious ceremonies like confirmation or perhaps even marriage. You took an oath to believe, obey, and fight. You made the party salute, copied after the ancient Roman salute, and eventually borrowed by Hitler, who learned a lot of his tricks directly from watching Mussolini. The local party officials then handed you a certificate and a rifle, which you were expected to use to defend whatever the leaders ordered you to do. If you got killed in the process, you would become a fascist martyr, and all the rest of the people would remember and celebrate you forever. Heaven for a good fascist was to be found in the memories of your comrades here in this life. The most impressive rituals, though, were not about you as an individual, of course. Remember, you're just a cog in the machine. The really impressive ritual events were mass marches that gathered all the faithful at mass rallies where they could listen to the sacred, divinely inspired words of their fearless leader. Standing there as just one face in a crowd of thousands or even tens of thousands drove home the point of just how insignificant you really are, how you can only do anything really important if you join with all these other faces around you and believe, obey, and fight as instructed by the leader. Your job is to follow instructions to the letter. Just as rituals put you in motion, translating the myths and doctrines of the totalitarian state into your personal behavior, symbols confront you with these same myths and doctrines in outward, visible forms and remind you to stay on course. Totalitarian parties almost always go in for massive, intimidating architecture, like the fascist party headquarters in Rome. Such monumentalism, with the great stern face watching you and row after row of the words yes covering the facade, reminds you in a most compelling way of your duty to believe, obey, and fight whenever you're ordered to do so. You're not important. Only the country is important. And you don't control the country, the leaders do that. If you happen to get killed in the process, well, that's the ultimate glory for you. Like the soldiers in the Roman legions who died all over the map, you will be making your country great. This is the highest goal you might get a chance to achieve. In the face of mortal danger, thinking of those Roman victory laurels and the glory that was Rome, your motto should be the motto of the early fascist gangs of thugs risking their lives in street battles with trade unionists and other enemies. Me ne frego. I don't care. My own life isn't important compared to the greater glory of the supreme leader up there making speeches to his rallies. Behind the strenuous efforts of Italian fascists and other totalitarian political movements to create their versions of political religion, there's an underlying basic assumption about ordinary people like you or me. The masses cannot recognize subtle distinctions, declared one book about the fascist system. They need spiritualism, piety, religious principles, and rituals. This condescending attitude about the capabilities of ordinary citizens strikes directly at the roots of the most fundamental ideas of democracy and self-government. It suggests that for a government to govern with the consent of the people, you can't just explain things to people and let them make rational choices. Fascism explicitly rejected rationalism, Gentile tells us. You have to use smoke and mirrors, like the Wizard of Oz, to trick them into consenting to be governed. This profound contempt by political elites for ordinary people like you or me echoes George Washington's comment about education and a few peculiar minds that might be capable of living rationally, but that most people need religious faith in order to live right. A standard piece of political wisdom to this day holds that politicians win debates by appealing to people's emotions rather than to facts and figures. This contest between logic and emotion goes way back. The Enlightenment of the 1700s was the heyday of logic, the age when philosophers were convinced that the path to progress and human happiness was through the application of human reason to our problems. You can hear this rational Enlightenment philosophy woven into the founding documents of the United States, with its separation of powers between church and state, which appeared right in the middle of this Enlightenment period. But people are never satisfied, apparently. During the 1800s, a new generation of philosophers, poets, novelists, and politicians reacted against the rationalism of the Enlightenment, complaining that just relying on logic and facts and science reduces life to a dry, dull dust of data that misses the vitality of life completely. The romanticism that they created relies on feelings instead of reason, on pathos rather than logos from the ancient Greek vocabulary. The Romantic tradition gave us great novels, passionate poetry, and also mystical ideas like the concept of a nation as more than just a collection of individuals, as some kind of transcendent reality greater than the sum of its parts. The nationalism that unified Italy and added it to our world of nation-states was a byproduct of both the Enlightenment and the Romantics. But political religion is a child of Romanticism. You're not supposed to think, only to believe and obey. Hitler summed it up with his Nazi slogan that also rejected dry, boring reason. Think with your blood, he told his followers, meaning the deepest, irrational, emotional race memories that he thought were the real wellspring of human motivation. In the fascist political religion described for us by Gentile, we can see the application of their belief in feelings instead of logic, in the power of emotions, especially when you can assemble lots of people together and whip them up emotionally with simple slogans. If you can reinforce this emotional response with symbols and rituals that keep your believers connected with one another, you may be able to channel them into following you so faithfully that you can take over a whole country, the way that Mussolini managed in Italy 100 years ago. The operating principles are actually hauntingly familiar. Most of them are exactly the same as the recipe for forming your own little religious cult, like the Reverend Moon or the Scientologists or the Millerites who thought the world was coming to an end in 1834, early in the Romantic era. But a political religion and the totalitarian state that it supports makes these small-scale religious cults look like peanuts in comparison. With Mussolini's political religion, we find ourselves running with the big dogs now. The trouble with a political religion like fascism or communism, though, is that it inherently reverses the tide of institutional differentiation that has been running for centuries as human societies expanded in scale and complexity. It folds religion back into politics, as in fascist Italy or Soviet Russia, or it folds politics back into religion, as in the Islamic Republic of Iran. This reduces the complexity and also the flexibility of society as a differentiated set of institutions. The totalitarian state relies on what we might call plan control. That is, all the decisions and instructions flow from the top down, from leaders to the anonymous cogs in their machine. Believe, obey, fight. There's no information flowing back up from the machine to the people operating it, no feedback, and therefore no possibility of flexibility, of adjusting to new information, because there is no input to the leaders. Those leaders have assumed that ordinary people are only good for being puppets, not for actually giving them any feedback that could improve how they do their job. In a world where even the largest nation-state is still embedded within a matrix of other countries and operates within a physical environment, plan control is a recipe for disaster. Only feedback control can allow a country, like a boat or a car, to navigate successfully through the world around it. Fusing together some of the differentiated institutions that provided that feedback, that interaction, that flexibility to modify your course in the world invites mistakes that can become fatal dead ends. The Soviet Union fused together politics, the economy, and whatever religion it allowed to survive into a single top-down hierarchy controlled by the Communist Party. The party wanted more cotton, so the leaders ordered irrigation and pesticides that pumped dry the Aral Sea, once thriving with boats and fishermen, leaving it a dead, polluted desert today. With no feedback of information flowing up to Mussolini and his fascist cohorts, there was no way to check or balance their absurd attempt to conquer a new Italian empire in Libya and Ethiopia. The Italian armies actually invaded Africa and tried to pull this off with disastrous consequences. Mussolini threw in with Hitler to go to war against pretty much everybody else in Europe and North America. We can't ask him now how that worked out for him because he was killed by his own people. His political religion blinded the whole country to the fatal course that these supposedly infallible leaders chose. When we consider Gentile's account of the fascist experiment creating a political religion, it seems pretty clear that this was a bad idea. By reversing the institutional differentiation of society, by trying to fuse together again the religious and political spheres of life, not to mention also the economic and educational institutions in Italian society, fascist Italy lost its ability to keep its balance in the world and was destroyed in a single generation. It also is clear that this idea of political religion, fusing together such differentiated institutions, is not at all the same thing as the civil religion described by Robert Bellah. The civil religion he describes implies no intention to absorb religion into politics and hand over the content of religious beliefs and practices to political authority. It also implies no religious control in the other direction, giving religious authorities power to dictate terms of political organization, legislation, or law enforcement. If anything, civil religion codifies the extent to which these two separate, differentiated spheres of life in modern society are still in contact, and creates the firewall that allows them to continue to operate each within their own institutional setting.